What's going on, guys? Hope this video finds you well. So a little over a year ago, I made a video talking about how I couldn't quite get fully invested into mainline Shin Megami Tensei, having tried a little bit of SMT 4, Nocturne, and then a pretty healthy chunk of Strange Journey Redux. I then went on to play the Digital Devil Saga duology, which I absolutely adored, and the rest of my Megami Tensei journey has been pretty well documented on the channel, both before and after that mainline SMT video I did. Originally, I was going to play the Devil Survivor games first, before jumping back into mainline, but I felt strangely compelled to jump back into SMT Nocturne, so I gave into that urge, started a fresh playthrough, and now have seen it through all to the end. I feel like I have quite a bit to say about it from pretty much all angles, but before I get into that, I am trying to hit 1,000 subscribers by the end of the year, so I would really appreciate it if you are not subscribed, if you would do so. Definitely plenty more Mega 10 stuff on the channel going forward, and I'll talk more about my plans following Nocturne at the end of the video for those curious. Let's start with the category I tend to start with in these types of videos, which is presentation, which is something that I find Atlus games generally do really well, primarily from the atmosphere and music standpoints. And Nocturne is no different. The atmosphere is absolutely fantastic, coupled with an excellent soundtrack as well, but you probably already knew that. The main negative thing I'll say about Nocturne presentation-wise is the remaster is extremely lackluster, which has been said plenty of times already. A lot of PS2 games hold up pretty well visually, assuming you're up-resing them on modern displays. But this game, for better or worse, does just look like an up-resed PS2 game. It doesn't seem like there was really a whole lot of effort put in as far as the actual remastering side of things, including the soundtrack being extremely compressed by default, although since I did play this on PC, I did install the HD audio mod, which greatly improved this. I didn't really have any issues, and I highly recommend installing that mod if you're going to play this on PC. And although the remaster is extremely lackluster as a product, and by virtue of that is very overpriced at an MSRP of 50 bucks, I waited for a slight sale and bought the digital deluxe edition for around 50 bucks, saving about 35% in the process. I do think I could have held out for a steeper sale, but at the same time, having never purchased Nocturne in the past, it doesn't particularly bother me. They added a merciful difficulty, which I didn't play on, I played on normal. There's a BGM pack for some of the other SMT games, although if you're playing Nocturne, I don't know why you wouldn't want to just hear Nocturne soundtrack. If you wanted to hear the battle themes from the other games, why not just play the other games, but to each their own. And then there's also, I believe, 2 locations that were added for grinding purposes. One for Maka, which is the currency, and one for experience. I kind of just stumbled upon these without really knowing what they were, and only accidentally used one singular level up item on one of my demons because I didn't really know what it even was, and then proceeded to never really go back there. And then of course the Maniacs pack and the Chronicle pack, which, for those who may not be aware, when Nocturne originally released in the West for the PS2, we did not get the vanilla version, we got the enhanced version, being the Maniacs version, which includes, famously, Dante from the Devil May Cry series, and then the Chronicle version features Raido Kuzunoha from the Devil Summoner games featuring that character. I don't know if this is a PC exclusive feature, but you can actually play the vanilla experience if you want without all of the Maniacs / Chronicle stuff. I don't particularly know why you would want to do that. The most famous version is the Maniacs version, and so I can't imagine many Westerners have experience with the vanilla Nocturne experience. And worth noting, if you're going to play on PC, I do recommend selecting either the Maniacs version or the Chronicle version when you select a new game, and not just a vanilla new game, if you want the full Nocturne experience as it has probably been pitched to you by whoever may have put this game on your radar to begin with. And I will also say that the quality of life features like selecting inherited skills when fusing demons is very much appreciated. Apparently that was patched in after the fact, which is kind of hilarious, but I'm glad that it's included. I'm not really a fan of the random inheritance, and I've kind of gone into that in previous videos as well, so I'm not going to get into it here. So now let's pivot into the story side of things, which was originally what kind of turned me off from Nocturne the last time, because I didn't really feel invested in the story early on, but I admittedly did not play very much of Nocturne. I don't think I ever really claimed that I did. This time though, I actually kind of found the events of the story to be pretty interesting ending, albeit few and far between, especially the further you get into the game, which did slowly result with my waning interest in the game the further I got. My play sessions kind of got shorter and shorter as I passed the mid game into the late game, but we can get into that a little bit later. So the general story setup for Nocturne is you're a student named whatever you want to name him, going to the hospital to visit your teacher alongside two of your other classmates. However, when you catch up to the other two at the hospital, you've all discovered that it's completely vacant, which is very strange and eerie. And as you're exploring to try to find where your teacher is, you stumble into the basement. A mysterious man summons a demon to try to kill you, only for your teacher to step in to save you, at which point you go to the roof to watch the world end with your teacher by your side. And this event is known as the Conception, where the world as our characters knew it basically enters a cocoon phase in the form of the Vortex world, which is like an inverted sphere. And so a mysterious woman and her young master, as she calls him, drops a bug into your face hole, and our main character turns into the iconic Demi-Fiend, which is just such a cool design for a main character. Now, even though story bits from this point on in the game are pretty sparse, there is definitely a lot to think about and reflect on regarding certain themes that the game tackles. I would still like for more overt storytelling, since what little there is already of that is really cool and interesting. It does seem like it's intentionally a minimalist approach, but I still found something like the Digital Devil Saga games to be more captivating from a story standpoint, simply because there was more of it. Although those games did come after and were kind of attempting a slightly different take. But back to Nocturne, the cutscenes in particular provided some really captivating and unique visuals that, again, I would have liked to see even more of. Although, it would have been nice if these were put into widescreen for the remaster, but whatever, I guess. Characters, however, I found to be pretty lacking, but I actually don't find this to be as much of a detractor as I initially expected. Similarly to the story, do I think it could have been better if they were more fleshed out? Probably, but because the Demi-Fiend, Chiaki, and Isamu get split up immediately following the Conception, I think it kinda makes sense that the three of you would continue going in your own directions. At first I thought that these two were not meant to be particularly close to the Demi-Fiend before the Conception happened, but towards the very end of the game, with your last encounter with Isamu, he refers to you as having been his friend. So maybe that's a translation thing, maybe they're not supposed to be particularly close, which I think would help justify the lack of characterization of these characters, because you're not intended to really be friends with them per se, but at least according to how they refer to you, I don't think that's entirely true. Although I wouldn't be surprised if your half demon, half human form off-put them to the point where they weren't sure if they trusted you or wanted to side with you after the Conception happened. None of these things seem particularly fleshed out. Maybe this is more fleshed out if you pick the endings that are affiliated with said characters, but ultimately it's something that I don't think was intentionally lacking, but ends up feeling lacking nonetheless. Anyway, due in part to these three characters splitting off in their own directions, they're able to come to different conclusions about how the world should be. Characters are kind of forming these ideologies with which to evolve the world past this cocoon phase that it's in into ultimately what you would deem, I guess, the butterfly phase, if we're going to continue with that metaphor. And you, the player in control of the Demi-Fiend's actions, must choose who to side with, if anyone at all. Which leads me into some of the optional content introduced with the Maniac's release, primarily being the Fiend boss fights, as well as the Labyrinth of Amala. The Fiends are bosses that you'll find throughout the Vortex world that allow you to unlock each Kalpa of the Labyrinth of Amala, and each Kalpa kind of functions as its own dungeon, which I guess pivots me into talking about dungeons in particular. The dungeons in Nocturne are usually regarded as one of the game's biggest strengths, and I definitely did enjoy a good number of them. The atmosphere was sublime, and the gimmicks in some of the dungeons were kind of cool. Some of them felt like they didn't take some of their ideas as far as they probably could have, but I guess the same could be said of Digital Devil Saga to an extent. Although, in my time with Strange Journey Redux, I found those dungeons to be a lot more compelling as dungeons. Maybe not quite as much atmospherically, but the actual dungeon crawling I think I enjoyed more. Whereas in Nocturne, even though most of the individual dungeons weren't that long, I was kind of getting tired of it by the end, kind of in a similar way to how I felt about Strange Journey Redux after finishing the 5th sector in that game, which did contribute, as I mentioned earlier, the kind of waning interest in Nocturne the further I got, and just kind of wanting to wrap things up at a certain point. I mean, that's not to say that I'm negative on the dungeons by any means, it's just that I didn't find them to be be like, holy shit, this is like the greatest dungeon crawling I've ever experienced kind of deal. The dungeon crawling is pretty similar though to Atlas's first person dungeon crawling. It's just that you're in a third person perspective. I do kind of wish that there was more diversity in the visual structure of the dungeons, which you kind of start to see later on, but there's a lot of long rectangular hallways that lead to perfectly rectangular rooms. It's kind of a small thing, but it is something that did stick out to me. And as for the Labyrinth of Amala, I do think that the Labyrinth of Amala felt more in line with Strange Journey dungeons than the kind of main quest, if you want to call it that, dungeons in Nocturne. I generally enjoyed the Labyrinth, although I did still kind of find that it was overstaying its welcome by the end. And while it is optional technically, I do think that going for the true demon ending in order to experience all of what Nocturne has to offer is probably the best way to go. Though if I do play this game again, I'll definitely check out some of the other endings. It is kind of unfortunate that a lot of the divergence with the alignment system in a lot of Mega 10 games is at the very end. Like, it's understandable because you can't build a massive JRPG and then have it branch too early, because then you're essentially creating two different games. But if you're playing through the entire game again with the sole purpose of experiencing a different ending, I don't really feel like it's worth it. However, if you enjoy the game as a whole to begin with and want to replay it just for the sake of replaying it, you might as well check out some of the other endings. That's kind of the approach I'll take when it comes to the other mainline games as I get to them. Now, moving into more of the core gameplay and combat stuff, I'll briefly discuss progression systems since there's not a whole lot to say. Demon Fusion, as always, is pretty cool. A lot of how it works specifically does still go over my head, but there are calculators and resources out there on how to fuse certain demons. I mean, you can kind of experiment in a way as well. I played on normal, and so I know on hard, I want to say everything costs 3 times as much, probably including summoning demons from the compendium. And so playing on normal, I didn't really have to deal with that. There are several opportunities to get a shit ton of Maka in Nocturne that'll last you most of the game. But the main thing you're going to be spending your in-game currency on is Magatama, which is how the Demi-Fiend earns skills. Now, each of these Magatama are basically different kinds of bugs similar to the one that was dropped into your face hole at the beginning of the game. You ingest these bugs, which is basically just equipping them. I mean, I guess the Demi-Fiend is just like throwing up and ingesting these things constantly throughout the game, which is pretty disturbing to think about, but you never really see it. Anyway, each of these different Magatama have different weaknesses and resistances. When you level up with a Magatama equipped, assuming you're high enough level, you will learn the next skill in line from said Magatama. Generally, if the Magatama is glowing and shaking pretty frequently, then you probably are high enough level to get whatever the next skill is for said Magatama. I didn't really know specifically which Magatama were best to prioritize. I did, however, know that a physical build for the Demi-Fiend is ideal, and so I very much prioritized a physical-based build and had great success with that. There are a good number of bosses and mini-bosses that either resist or are immune to physical attacks in certain ways, but generally the physical build was pretty powerful, which kind of gets me into the combat specifically. So Nocturne is infamous for its difficulty, but I actually found it to be not that bad and actually quite disappointing in a lot of instances regarding some of the more noteworthy boss encounters that people tend to have trouble with, I guess. As I mentioned before, I played on normal, which I assume is how most people do their first playthrough, which actually has me extremely confused as to why people talk about this game like it's the most difficult and punishing thing ever. Maybe that conversation is more so about hard mode, but I don't know. I've seen so many forum posts and whatnot about how many attempts people took on Matador or Thor or Mott and some of these other more infamous bosses, and I just didn't really struggle with any of them. I'm not trying to say this as a flex or anything, but if you know how I play JRPGs, I was consistently extremely underleveled compared to what a lot of guides and forum posts suggested, which I usually looked up after the fact just out of curiosity, because I would get through a boss fight easily and be like, am I over leveled? And then look at what people are saying for suggested level, and they're like, you should be level 20 or 22 or whatever it is for Matador, and I'm like, what? Maybe they're talking about hard mode, but I was, as far as I understand it, very underleveled a lot of the time and got by just fine. However, this not being my first Mega 10 game, I think, plays a role in this. I definitely could see someone jumping into Nocturne as their first Mega 10 game and struggling a lot because they don't know what skill names are and what they do, and they don't know that you can stack buffs, and just like any Mega 10 specific kind of thing, they don't understand how press turn works, whatever it might be. But having played the Digital Devil Saga games, which play very similarly to Nocturne, right? Press turn is a goated turn-based system just as a general structure. press turn is easily one of, if not probably my favorite setup for a combat system in JRPGs. However, I do also like the one more system from Persona. Let's focus in on kind of the process when it comes to playing Nocturne, right? For one, I failed to mention this earlier, but I have very little tolerance for random encounters, especially the older I get. But I do like that there is a radar in the Mega 10 games from Nocturne on that have random encounters, so that way you can at least know when to anticipate an encounter. That goes a long way. I don't really mind random encounters if you know when they're coming. It's just when they are truly random and you have no indication, it's just really annoying. But even though the radar did numb the effect of the random encounters to a degree, I still did find the encounter rate to be pretty obnoxious. Since I'm the type of player who very much does not fight every random encounter they come across, I could not imagine playing a JRPG like that. That sounds extremely tedious and unnecessary. I do understand it to a point when every random encounter is crafted to kill you and set you back, so that way you take every encounter seriously instead of just trying to run, but that wasn't really my experience with Nocturne. There is a demon that you can purchase in the first Kalpa of the Labyrinth of Amala that comes with Istoma, which allows you to avoid low-level encounters, so this didn't really come into play unless I was backtracking, which there was a fair amount of, both voluntary and mandatory. But this demon also comes with a number of other helpful traversal skills. And generally I found random encounters to not really be all that threatening. I could probably count on one hand the number of times random encounters wiped me, or at least, defeated the Demi-Fiend, which results in the game over. Definitely a different story on hard mode as far as I understand it. It's harder to run and you're more likely to get ambushed and stuff like that. I just generally didn't find this game to be that punishing from that front. Save points were very generous actually, but I don't think I actually died until my first attempt at fighting Matador, which is the first of the fiends that I mentioned earlier to unlock the Kalpas in the Labyrinth of Amala. Matador is extremely infamous. I've seen people say they didn't beat him until like attempts in the teens, and I beat him my second try. Again, I do think that my previous knowledge from playing other Mega 10 games really helped. Even if you've played just a Persona game, I actually think that's kind of enough to get you over the learning curve of Nocturne, because at least you know what skills do, right? You know Agi is fire magic, you know Tarukaja is an attack buff, etc, etc. There are differences for sure, but I could definitely see that as being a hurdle. Now, my philosophy when it comes to approaching boss fights in JRPGs generally is if I don't know what's upcoming, I haven't played the game before, I'll just go into it blind and just see what's in store. Just try to kind of scout what kind of skills they have, what their weakness may be, if they have any, what they resist or absorb or reflect or whatever, and just kind of make do with what I have. And if I happen to get by on the first try, so be it. And then if I don't, then I can kind of evaluate, okay, was that a matter of me getting unlucky? Is this something I think that I could do with my current setup, just need to approach it differently? Or do I need to completely change my party setup? So what I did for Matador was I grinded primarily for Maka in order to buy the Magatama available just prior to Matador, one of which nulls force damage, which Matador specializes in. And so that was an easy equip. Ended up getting Tornado, which proved extremely useful later on. And for the record, Matador is the only fiend that forces his battle on you, whereas the others you have to actively participate in the labyrinth for them to spawn into the world, I believe. But yeah, I was level 16 when I beat Matador. And so I equipped the Magatama I mentioned, and I recruited a Nozuchi to have another null force damage demon in my party. And then I also used the gems that I had to purchase an Aquans from the trader who allows you to trade for elementals in Ginza, who has access to Sukukaja, which allowed me to buff my agility enough to catch up to Matador's Red Capote, which maxes his agility, essentially casting Sukukaja 4 times. I also casted Sukukaja 4 times to even the playing field there, and also 1 or 2 of my other demons immune to force damage led to a fairly easy second attempt. Thor was kind of a similar example where I set up the buffs I had, primarily Sukukaja, and just kind of winged it on my first attempt and beat him literally no issue. My party was pretty weak by the end, but this was just like a random bullshit attempt that I do on a first attempt for bosses, like I was saying, and I beat Thor, who is also seen as a hurdle. The only other boss I can think of that gave me trouble the first time was Osei, because I didn't really have a great setup for him. I don't remember how much preparation I did, but that was another, I believe, second try. And then pretty much all of the others were just kind of first try. However, I will say that the later I got, the easier it was to exploit certain things. So the fiends are extremely powerful. When you beat beat them, you unlock the ability to fuse them, although you need to be high enough level. So Matador is level 30. And so it's going to be a while after beating Matador until you can fuse him. The second fiend that you can fuse is Daisojo, who has access to the skill Meditation, which drains an opponent's HP and, crucially, MP. And so if I was fighting a boss in like the mid to late game that I didn't have the appropriate tools for, such as Makala, whom the Demi-Fiend was basically useless against as a physical build, and honestly many others past that point, I kind of just set up my buffs, spammed Meditation, and then eventually the boss would run out of MP. And because I was out damaging them still throughout the fight, because I did have some skills that were at least effective on said bosses, I was able to win. You could say to me, if you didn't want these bosses to be as exploited, then don't use Daisojo, or like fuse him for a stronger demon or whatever. But because my philosophy going into boss fights is, on my first attempt, I'm just going to do whatever I can, and then it kept working, why on earth would I try something different, right? My philosophy after kind of screwing myself with my Strange Journey playthrough, fusion-wise, is to only really fuse when I absolutely have to. If I had faced more bosses that wiped me, I feel like I would have been more incentivized to actually fuse a different team of demons and strategize a little bit more distinctly for each fight. Because, you know, setting up buffs and doing this kind of stall tactic is a strategy, but the fact that it works on 90% of the bosses in the game is kind of insane. And then the ones that weren't resistant or immune to physical attacks, Demi-Fiend just, you know, focused up and fired off a divine shot or even regular attacks and did a shit ton. Do that a couple of times and then it's over. Which just kind of led me to thinking that buffs are just extremely powerful, and there weren't enough bosses in Nocturne that used Takaja to neutralize them for it to really be like, oh shit, I can't really use buffs. If anything, I would use a single buff to bait them into using Takaja, or sometimes only set up 3 layers of buffs in the instance that they only use it at 4 layers, etc., etc. And these are all strategies that I knew from having played other Megaten games, but I really found this game to be disappointingly easy compared to what people say about it. This is based on normal mode, of course. If I were to go back and play it on hard mode or play with the hard type mod and have a different experience, maybe we'll talk about that at a later date. But for my first playthrough of Nocturne, difficulty wise, just like extremely exploitable. And the thing about how exploitable it is, that is something that is kind of earned in a sense from the player, like knowing how the mechanics work and building your team in a specific way. But I did find that it was antithetical to kind of the philosophy of Megaten games in that they really ideally want you to be fusing your demons constantly, but the fiends were so fucking powerful that nothing I could fuse, even if they were higher level than the fiends that I had in my party, were gonna end up performing better because they either had a weakness or they couldn't inherit certain skills or whatever it might have been. And so I didn't find myself fusing nearly as often as I was in Strange Journey. And as I said, I kind of fused myself into a corner in Strange Journey where it would have taken, I think, a lot of grinding and fusing for me to get past the point that I was at in that game. But generally, I found that the bosses in Strange Journey and even Digital Devil Saga kind of forced me to rethink my strategy way more often. Maybe if I played DDS again, I would find similar exploits, but I just don't recall that really being much of an option. But to clarify, most of what I've said thus far applied up to a certain point in the game, at which point I actually found the boss fights, even if I did beat them on my first try, to be way more interesting and less exploitable as well. Just a quick heads up that I'm going to be showing footage of the final true demon ending boss. I usually try to not use super late game footage unless I'm explicitly going into spoilers, which I'm not going to do, but because I was lacking in late game footage and this video ended up being longer than I expected, I just went back and fought the 2 final bosses. So I'm going to show footage of me fighting Lucifer, but it's not footage of my initial win against him, and so it went a little bit differently, but I generally use the same strategy that I mentioned later on in this section of the video, and it worked just fine. I was never really concerned. And the fact that I was able to pull off beating him with the state of my party being what it is, 2 attempts back to back, I think kind of speaks for itself in some sense. But most of the section is going to be me breaking down my experience going through the endgame content, as I would deem it, which I guess would start with Beelzebub, who wiped me on my first attempt because Death Flies caught me off guard whenever he starts using that. But I just equipped a Magatama that nulled that, and then the fight just went swimmingly, more or less using the same strat that I was mentioning earlier. Metatron I beat my first try, but that was the boss fight that was starting to indicate, okay, Daisojo and some of the other demons that I had kept around even in reserve were becoming too underpowered to reliably use going forward, especially because you get Dante before the 5th Kalpa of the Labyrinth, so that was was an easy team slot. He never really left my party except for, I can think of maybe 1 or 2 instances that I'll get to. And then I highly recommend keeping the first pixie that you recruit at the beginning of the game. And so that really just left 1 team slot for my regular running squad, and the squad that I ended up beating the game with as well. And then you get to the final dungeon where you fight Ahriman, Noah, Baal Avatar, and then Kagatsuchi, followed by Lucifer if you're going for true demon ending, which I did. Those first 3 I beat first try, and even though Ahriman was pretty easy, I quite enjoyed the gimmick of the fight. I thought it was kind of cool. It seems more in line with the types of bosses you would face in later Mega 10 games, which again makes sense because Nocturne was kind of the progenitor of this style of gameplay for Megami Tensei. At least as far as games that released in the West, Nocturne kind of set the standard here. So it's understandable that a lot of early and even mid and even somewhat into the late game bosses are more or less just skill checks as far as like, do you know how to use buffs? Do you have magic coverage for when your physical skills are useless? Do you have Dekaja and Dekunda to deal with enemy buffs and debuffs, etc., right? But as someone who has played several Mega 10 games before, which Atlas could not have possibly accounted for when they made Nocturne, so I get that. It makes a lot of the boss fights prior to this endgame portion feel really simple by comparison. And some people would criticize Megami Tensei gameplay as just being hit weakness, get more turns, win. But like, while that can be true, sort of, at least of bosses that have a weakness, which many don't in these games, a lot of the strategy in Megami Tensei games comes down to your preparation. And yes, there is execution involved for sure. You gotta make sure that you don't fuck up. You gotta keep into account the various attacks. You know, this boss could pull out this attack twice in a row kind of thing, or whatever it might be. And so even if my party's at like 90% health, maybe I just want to use a healing spell to cap them off instead of going for a big hit this turn. Stuff like that. It's about finding windows of opportunity to set up or heal or deal damage, etc. and so on. But it is kind of a bummer when I found a lot of the boss fights in Nocturne to more or less be auto-battleable. And what I mean by that is not letting the AI do whatever. I mean having the AI just repeat what I did the previous turn over and over and over again until I eventually beat the boss, because they couldn't do enough to me to counteract what I was doing turn by turn. I wish that there were more team comp checks in this game. And sure, if I didn't use Daisojo or just, you know, outright didn't use the Fiends at all, it would likely be a different story. And I may actually consider that stipulation for following runs of Nocturne. That meditation exploit, I would call it, is not even something that I looked up prior. It's something that I just kind of discovered on my own. I was like, okay, I kind of have nothing better to go for on this boss because I don't have the coverage to hit its weakness or like whatever it was. And so I might as well just use meditation, right? Because it seems to be working. And then eventually discovered, oh wait, bosses have an MP pool that you can deplete and then they're kind of fucked. But anyway, the Noah fight took me way longer than it should have for me to figure out how that gimmick works specifically, but I ended up scraping through just fine. I was definitely a little bit nervous though. Baal Avatar was a complete joke, and then I'll touch on the final bosses after I talk about the Bando Shrine, which you unlock by acquiring all of the Magatama, the last of which you get towards the very end of the final dungeon. I actually really dug the Bando Shrine. Dungeon-wise, it was pretty basic, but I did kind of like figuring out which path to take, and then figuring out that each colored teleporter indicates something about the boss you're about to face. And then the bosses themselves were actually pretty damn engaging. 1 or 2 of them even forced me to kind of rebuild my squad because I lacked the elemental coverage that I needed for certain ones, or I needed to sub out someone like Dante for a demon that had access to a particular element. But those fights were cool. I think I did beat 2 of them on my first try, and then one of them was maybe 2 or 3 tries, and the other was probably about the same, like a handful of tries, but it was more than I had to deal with for the majority of the game's runtime, which I really appreciated and wish that this kind of stuff was implemented earlier, although I do think it is kind of a bummer that a lot of the crazy shit a lot of these bosses can do is thanks to Beast Eye and Dragon Eye, which for one cost them some MP, so if you do the Daisojo strat and drain them of MP, they can't use it, which is really funny for the AI to try to cast spells when they can't. There definitely were plenty of times where the AI was just dumb and didn't play as optimally as they could, and it bit them in the ass because I had, you know, a demon that absorbed whatever they went for, or whatever it might have been. But these skills cost 1 press turn, and then Beast Eye gives 2 half turns, whereas Dragon Eye gives 4 half turns, essentially just giving them more turns instead of being limited to the most common 2 press turns that a boss has. I get that it's a balance thing because Nocturne is a pretty even playing field where everything that applies to your side of the field also applies to the enemy side of the field as far as what can be exploited. It's just, you have the advantage of being able to build your team and being a human being and not an AI that goes for fire spells when you have an absorb fire demon in your party. I guess that it would be kind of unfair if the opposing demons could recognize that and then never go for that, instead only going for stuff that's effective, assuming they have it, but that's kind of a whole nother conversation. My point is, why not just give bosses more press turns to begin with, instead of giving them 2 and then they're just going to use Beast Eye anyway, so they essentially have 3. So why not just start them with 3 and then get rid of these skills? I find press turn in particular, and really just Atlas games in general from Nocturne on, to be pretty snappy, which is why Megami Tensei overall is my favorite JRPG series combat-wise, because you're able to do cool shit. It's strategic, you get the flashy animations and stuff, but it's snappy. It moves along pretty quickly. Well, I guess except when you get ambushed by like 6 or 7 demons at a time, and then they all have to take their turn, and they're usually doing some stupid bullshit. It's not even like attacking, they'll just set up buffs. That gets kind of annoying, but when it comes to like Beast Eye, Dragon Eye, it's just like, you gotta watch this animation, and then they're just gonna cast a couple of buffs, and then finally attack. Just start them out with 4 press turns or something to make it even though it's a 1v4. Or, like some bosses do, summon allies. Not that that mattered much in certain cases, like the ball avatar, but it is an option. And then, as far as my experience with the final bosses, since I was going for true demon ending, Kagutsuchi, I beat first attempt, not really any problems. I mean, I kind of had to learn his skills and figure out what the general pattern was, but because I got the final Magatama from the Bando Shrine, Demi-Fiend was able to at least burn some of Kagutsuchi's turns when it went for elemental spells, which was nice. And I generally found going for all the Magatama to be a pretty satisfying thing. You have to double back and fight some optional bosses, which were pretty exploitable, but still. And then the Bando Shrine, of course, I thought that was super sick, and you get an insane reward from it, which was really cool and felt extremely rewarding, having gone out of my way to do that. Even if the Magatama you get is pretty insane, you only get it at the very end of the game anyway, so that's probably for the best. So yeah, Kagutsuchi was whatever. And then Lucifer wiped me my first time. It didn't help that he went for High King back-to-back one turn, which I don't think that's what killed me, but it definitely set me behind, or at least killed one of my demons. Maybe it killed my healer or something like that. Granted, I was in the 4th slot in addition to Dante and Pixie running, I think it was a Loa, which is like a level 53 demon or something, as my buff demon. I think it died to High King even with Rakukaja's setup. I think I grinded like a level or 2 to get myself to 67 to fuse a Kali as my buff bot, and ended up beating the game at level 67. Using Dante's Provoke to lower the enemy's defense by 2 levels and raise their attack by 2 levels, Dekajaing it away with Kali, doing that twice, mind you, to get him to min defense. Meanwhile, setting up buffs with Kali within the first couple of turns as well. And it seemed like Lucifer prioritized Dekundaing himself over Dekajaing me, because the first attempt he Dekaja'd me, and that kind of set me behind, especially because Loa was just a very weak demon to be using on Lucifer. Kali with buffs set up did just fine against High King. What was unfortunate is that my Pixie got muted, and I didn't have any dismutes in my inventory, and so I had to finagle the Nue that you buy in the labyrinth onto the field. It died the first time I attempted this. Resummon it again after reviving him, using Mutudi on Pixie, and then it wasn't an issue. I think Pixie ended up getting statused again, but it wasn't one that really affected her heal bot capabilities. But yeah, I just kept making sure Lucifer's defense was minimum, and then he prioritized using Dekunda, so that way I could keep my buffs. I don't think he ever Dekaja'd me during that second attempt. And just focusing, divine shotting, stingering with Dante every so often. Maybe if I get a lucky crit, just attacking with Kali once I was fully buffed up, and just eventually took Lucifer down. It was a really gripping fight because, like I said, I had to try to summon fucking Nue in there, which is extremely low level. It was definitely a cool fight, but I feel like I've seen people suggest you should be entering the Tower of Kagutsuchi or like fighting Beelzebub and or Metatron at like level 75, which just seems like extreme overkill to me. I did have a backup plan. Since I didn't have Debilitate at all, my backup plan, if this second attempt didn't work, was I was going to grind to level 70, fuse Nyx, and then get her to learn Debilitate alongside the buffs, so that way we could do the whole buff debuff thing a little bit more smoothly, but just didn't end up mattering, man. I feel like I got fairly unlucky with Pixie getting muted and some other stuff in that fight, but maybe if I had gotten more unlucky, like maybe if he went for double High King again or Dekaja'd me, but he didn't. So it just wasn't really that much of a problem. And again, I'm not trying to say this to flex, I'm trying to say this as an indication that I really don't think that this game is as hard as a lot of people make it out to be. Even though I found most of this game to be not really that difficult, I actually overall really enjoyed my time with it. There were lulls, for sure, but I look back at the experience, FPS, and it is definitely a game that I would play again, primarily from a gameplay standpoint, and because I'm kind of curious about the other endings, which I would definitely go for if I were to replay this game, which I likely will at some point, mostly because the vibes are immaculate. And I know saying that I enjoyed a game that I found not that difficult is gonna blow your minds, because Nocturne isn't that hard, but you still enjoyed it? Wait, games that aren't ball-crushingly difficult are fun? No way, not in Megami Tensei. Come on, man. Persona's for babies, DDS isn't that hard, but Nocturne, man, that's the real shit. Come on, dude. Stop it. This is all to say, like, let's take a step back. Nocturne was the first of its kind as far as press turn and a lot of these systems. Demon Fusion, impressively enough, was actually present in SMT 1 and 2, which I think is kind of crazy that that existed in Super Famicom games, but that's besides the point. Nocturne kind of laid the groundwork for mainline SMT going forward, kind of like how Persona 3 did for the Persona series. Kind of interesting how Atlus, in some sense, reinvented both of those series on the PS2, and that is kind of currently what we view these series as being in the present day. So yeah, that was generally my experience with Shin Megami Tensei Nocturne. While it might have sounded like there was a lot about it that I wasn't too hot on, which on one hand is kind of true, and not to compare constantly as I've been doing throughout the video, but I still deem the Digital Devil Saga games must-plays for any JRPG fan. Whereas with Nocturne, I do think it is a must-try because of how iconic it is, and how it may even click more so with you than it did for me. Even though I did overall enjoy my time with it, I wouldn't have pushed myself to finish it if I was straight up not enjoying it. I just thought that certain elements were a little too exploitable, and I thought that for how sparse the story was and how lacking the characters were, that it went on a little longer than I would have liked. But then again, if I go back and play it and I don't do the True Demon ending, then the playthrough would end up being shorter. So my playtime, according to my save file in the game, was just over the 40-hour mark. Probably like 41 or 42 by the time the final bosses were all said and done. Although according to Steam, factoring in the time that I spent with Nocturne over a year ago at this point, it's probably around 50-ish. I think it is likely that I will play Nocturne again someday when I have the itch to dive back into this world. Either way, let me know what you guys think about Shin Megami Tensei Nocturne. This is a hugely iconic game, definitely one that everyone should check out. Although do not buy the remaster full price unless you just have a 50 in your pocket that you're trying to burn. Definitely recommended to wait for a sale if you can. And as far as Mega 10 stuff going forward, before I jump into the Devil Survivor games, which I've been meaning to do for a long ass time, I need to finish Fire Emblem Thracia 776 because I don't want to play two strategy RPGs at the same time, even if they may be different in a lot of ways. And so once I'm done with Thracia, I'll pivot into Devil Survivor as my strategy RPG. But then as far as traditional JRPGs go, I think I'm going to take a little bit of a break from mainline, but likely the next game I would jump back into is Strange Journey, although I think I'm going to check out the DS version this time and just see if it's paced a little bit better, because kind of similar to how I talked about Nocturne, I felt like the optional dungeon being the Womb of Grief in Strange Journey Redux was causing the runtime of the game to kind of drag in a way that I wasn't a fan of. And plus there are certain changes from vanilla Strange Journey to Redux that it seems like it's worth checking out the original Strange Journey just to kind of see how certain systems operated. I'm kind of hoping that SMT4 gets an official port to modern platforms sooner than later, so that way I can play it that way. But if it comes down to it and I have to emulate it again, I'll do so, I guess. For Apocalypse, I know people swear by that game's gameplay, but from what I've seen of the story and characters, as a big Persona fan, I really don't think that that is it, Chief. I can't help but think that it's the localization that was the problem. I jumped into Apocalypse after trying out SMT4 just out of curiosity, and within the first like 5 minutes, a character said totes. Let's totes pick up that demon comp, or like whatever it was, and it's like, I don't know. A little side tangent in this extended outro, but again, from what I've seen of SMT4 Apocalypse, like writing-wise and character and story-wise, I think it's hilarious that people compare it to Persona, because I feel like Persona is not even remotely as cringe-inducing as what I've seen out of Apocalypse, but that's from an outsider's perspective, so take that with a grain of salt. And then SMT5, of course, I'm interested in, but I'm really hoping that that gets an official port to PC at the very least by the time it's time for me to get around to playing that one. I'm also kind of interested in the Raito games, but I'm not sure when I'll get around to those or if I'll play them to completion or not. But as far as older Mega 10 games like pre-Nocturne, I tried SMT 1 and 2 for a little bit, and I can't with those games. I'm not saying they're bad or anything, I didn't play enough to really determine that, but it's just not really what I'm looking for. I think with a lot of the pre-PS2 Mega 10 games, I'm just gonna kind of rely on Marsh's videos since he's able to kind of break down the events of these games in an interesting and entertaining enough way to where I don't really feel compelled to play them, especially with the more obscure titles. But even SMT 1 and 2, they're just too old school for me, especially with the lack of press turn or anything like that. It's just like not as interesting to me, even if the story and the themes and all that kind of stuff is really great, which I believe people when they say that, but it just doesn't feel worth it to like play through the entire game just for that. And so yeah, I think I've covered all my bases. Thank you to my channel members, and shout outs to the Space Cowboy at the Super Shadow Operative tier. I've been pretty happy about the steady growth the channel's been seeing lately, and every bit of support helps with that. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, of course, if you enjoyed, and I will catch you guys in the next video.